As long as I can remember, Australia have been a powerhouse in rugby. I remember my dad showing me Mick the Munchkinner's VHS tape of the 1999 World Cup, which Australia famously won that year. I was also shown another World Cup cassette, the 2003 World Cup review, where the Wallabies hosted the tournament. Watching this, I discovered that Australia had won 2 of the last 4 World Cups. So I guess I've always subconsciously thought of the Wallabies as a big deal. A preconception which I've never really had any reason to doubt. However, recently things have changed, and it's time for the Wallabies to do or die. Now let's first look at the results Australia had in 2018. First off, they lost a 3-test series 2-1 to the Irish. Then, a 3-0 whitewash against the All Blacks in the Bledisloe Cup, capped off by exchanging wins with both the Springboks and Pumas in the Rugby Championship, which wasn't a complete disaster, but then came the European Spring Tour, where they lost to Wales, which in previous years was an automatic win, and after that they won a pretty unremarkable game against Italy, setting up for their tour-defining game against England, which they lost badly. This isn't right, which begs the question, what's changed? Now in these cases, there are on-field factors and off-field factors, so let's start with the off-field action. So Australia is a sport-mad country, which has its pros and cons. In terms of pros, it's a whole country that on the base level loves sport. But in terms of cons, if you're one of the sports that's low down in the pecking order, you're going to struggle, which unfortunately has happened to rugby union. A survey done by the Business Insider in 2016 showed the astonishing stat that in terms of participation numbers, rugby union in Australia is down 63% since 2001, and the number of active players playing the sport has fallen to just 55,000. Now to put that in perspective, the number one sport in the country is soccer, and it boasts an impressive 623,000 active players. Now you look at the other sports that would potentially have players who can cross over to rugby, like Rugby League and Aussie Rules. And although the numbers have fallen for those sports as well, they still at the very least boast double the active players that Rugby Union has, with Rugby League having 127,000 and Aussie Rules having 253,000. And all this data seems to point to people losing interest in our beautiful game, which hasn't been without its reasons. Some people believe it's because of the Australian Rugby Union's focus on television deals rather than the grassroots level of the game. That has always had to fight hard to get kids playing due to all the other sports competing for the youngsters' attention. Some people also point to the lack of success in Super Rugby, which in recent times had the Australian teams holding an over 20-game long losing streak against their Kiwi counterparts. And all this seems to point to a team that is successful in spite of their circumstances, rather than because of them, which is an amazing achievement considering that this country always produces such amazing players, despite it currently only being the country's 26th favourite sport out of 27. So with all that in mind, let's move on to the on-field stuff, which could be described as off-field stuff, but I feel like because it's involving the players that play on the field, fight me. So the Australian public have recently voted on whether they want to legalise gay marriage. Now the country has decided they want to legalise it, which is great, but one player in the Wallaby squad has decided to make his very strong opinions on this matter known to the world, and has put his teammates, coach and the Australian Rugby Union in a very uncomfortable position, because there obviously were calls for every one of those people to condemn what he has said, as well as the calls for him not to be picked. But because he's literally one of the best players in the world, what would usually be an easy decision turned into a bit of a dilemma. Do you condemn this player who is one of your few mainstream stars who has literally played both the sports that you are competing for players against, and have him publicly outed and have him probably go back to one of those other sports, and also have a lot of your already small fan base go with him, because if you don't have Israel Folau, what's the point? Or do you keep him in your team and have it divide an already struggling squad? They chose the latter. And this hasn't been the only thing dividing the squad in 2018. Most recently, Kurtley Beale and Adam Ashley Cooper broke one of the team rules by having ladies back at their hotel. Now, I don't believe they've done anything wrong, but someone decided that it was important enough of an issue to tell Coach Cheika, and this time Cheika chose to leave these two out of the squad to face England. Now, there's a lot to read into here. First, even though it's a silly rule in my opinion, the players have decided and come up with these rules, and these two players, who I'm big fans of, have decided to ignore them. Second, whoever has seen this has decided that it's important enough to tell the boss, even though they're two of the best players in the team. And it put Cheika in another very uncomfortable position where he had no choice really but to drop 2 of his best players right before a tour-defining game. And speaking of the boss, let's talk about whether Michael Cheika is the right man for the job. Yes, he is. No debate. In terms of Australian coaches, I believe that there isn't anyone who understands the culture more of the Wallabies and who has created a style to match the style that is played over there to highlight and help his players excel. Of course, there's the argument that if Schmidt is available, you get Schmidt, and I understand that, but he's probably going to go to the All Blacks. So I believe that Cheika is definitely the inspirational, passionate figure that you need, and I think he's just going to be thrown under the bus by all the bullshit that's going on around him, which raises the question of what's next. For me, it's all about the World Cup. I believe if the World Cup goes back to Australia, the Australian rugby powers that be have an opportunity to ride the momentum of that and rebuild the reputation of the sport in the country. But it's all or nothing. And if they have a poor showing at the World Cup, things will only get worse.